Smaller houses, more houses, and an increase in wages. The history of property and why these three things are dictating property prices. Since 1086, the Doomsday Book, property prices have near enough doubled on a decade-by-decade basis, with land values being around 70,000 for the whole of the UK back then, compared to now where an average property costs over £270,000. But is that the most accurate way to measure the true cost of properties? I think a fairly accurate way of looking at this is to adjust for inflation and real-term wages. Let's face it, what we're getting paid today on average isn't the same as 50, 100 or 200 years ago. With almost 1,000 years of analysis and statistics to choose from, I thought I would narrow it down to the two past centuries, the last 200 years or 170-ish in particular, to see what's happened in the global and UK-based economy. Two things you're going to notice from this graph that I have borrowed from Schroders, thanks for that, is that you can see, number one, property prices don't always go up, which I'll get to, and nor is it the most expensive. So what you're seeing right now on this graph is, first of all, a massive dip for around 70 years, and then over time increasing back up. Well, Jamie, if property prices double on average every 10 years, what the hell happened there? Well, we'll call it a bit of a blip, right? But no, we'll get round to that in a moment. But what we're looking at in terms of real-term costs is this little metric around here. What you can see right now is the average property prices is around 8.25 times the average salary. So that's quite expensive, right? Because considering the long-term average is 4.5. Well, actually, not really if you compare it historically, where in around 1845, around 170 years ago, you can see that on average, property prices were over 13 times the average salary. So what happened and why does it have such an impact on today's prices? Whilst I'm not saying it's a good idea to stretch ourselves further, historically what it does show us if we can make our money go a lot further. So when we talk naturally today about people stretching themselves too thin, actually, it seems like our ability to manage money has actually decreased. We end up spending our things on liabilities. Now, a house that you live in is also a liability. For the purpose of this video, that's a fairly stable asset. It's not exactly the same as today where you'll go and spend 5 grand on some handbags or 200,000 on a car. It just doesn't happen with the average person 200 years ago. So what actually happened to cause this 70-year slump? In a word, the Victorians. One of the biggest things that impact property prices isn't investors. It's not actually interest rates. It's not people getting obsessed with living in them. It's the availability of supply. And what happened over that 70-year period from 1845 onwards is this huge influx of property being built. And by the way, when I'm saying huge, I mean they doubled their stock over a 70-year period. Imagine the entirety of the UK today, which is around 28 million houses. Think about how densely populated areas of the UK are now from property. Imagine that, 56 million over a 70-year period. That's an absolutely insane level of growth. So between 1851 and 1911, they went from 3.8 million up to 8.9 million. So it's way over doubling. So if you think about the world's population or the UK's population at the time, think about how much more of that population is suddenly getting facilitated in a really aggressive nature. So naturally, the demand was wherever it was, but the supply has just shot up dramatically. Naturally, if you know anything about some basic economics, if supply suddenly goes up and demand doesn't increase in line with that, property prices will go down. But it actually is much more than that, or should I say a lot less. What do I mean by a lot less? Well, what I mean is property sizes. So what also happened over this 70-year period is we went through a huge shift in the UK to these big detached properties, and this was the first introduction of terrace properties. Taking the average size property from 913 square meters to 258 square meters, which is still a pretty large property in comparison to what we're dealing with today, but that's roughly 25% of the size. So now we've got a huge increase in the supply of properties whilst also cutting the size of the properties in quarters. So when you think about that logically, it's hold on, so now there's an abundance of property available and now you're wanting me to pay whatever price for 25% of the size. Hopefully it doesn't take a genius at this point to understand why prices would plummet. So think about this. The price per unit would plummet, but the overall property market actually still increased. It's just the unit prices would drop in a dramatic way. The final big thing at the start of the 1900s was this massive shift from a renter economy into a home ownership economy. So in 1918, it was roughly 75% of the UK's population were renters. There was no real obsession about owning property because it was just completely unfeasible for the average person to own a near 1,000 square meter property. That's ridiculous, right? But now because of the oversupply in the market and the shrinkage by about 75% in the property size, suddenly the idea of home ownership went from dream to reality and flipped that percentage round over that 70-year period, roughly equating to 75% home ownership by the end of that century. So the real question is, are we likely to see the same thing happening? And I don't think so. If we look at those major implications of what we're looking at, the two biggest being the size of the properties and the massive increase in supply, are we likely to mimic that as a percentage again? I don't think so. So are we likely to increase by 8.9 million properties over the next 7 years? Yeah, probably no problem. But as a percentage of the population, that's actually not that much. Bear in mind, by the end of 2022, we're going to have around 1 million housing shortage. As it is, it's really not that dramatic of an increase. What we would have to see is going from 28 million to over 56 million properties in the UK in that 70-year span. And I just cannot see how that's going to be feasible. Well, what about properties getting even smaller? Well, for short asses like me, that might be okay living in a hobbit hole, but for most of us, that's not going to be feasible and probably not good for the increase in the economy over the long term. So in London and some other central locations, you do see these micro apartments coming up, but I really don't think that's going to roll out to the whole of the UK. So what is our best bet then? Well, really all we can look forward to is an increase in interest rates, which hurts us in other ways, but it does slow the demand, and an increase in wages. Now, this will naturally progress anyway, but hopefully this will allow people with more purchasing power. The issue with that is that again becomes cyclical, because as wages increase, people push themselves more, pushes the prices up, then we're priced out, then we have to increase more. So actually, it kind of feels like everyone's getting paid more, but really inflation comes into effect and every pound we earn is actually worth less. Great, thank you, government. So then what is the real impact that we can be looking at? House builders. Okay, there's land available in the UK, but we're really stubborn as a country. We hate it as soon as a house builder comes into play. We've got really fractioned and broken down planning laws and processes. It's completely archaic, and we've got a government that supports themselves getting voted. And I'm not just talking about Conservatives or Labour. I mean the government system in general is all based about getting voted in again, rather than looking after the people. Now, there is a massive housing shortage in the UK. There's a massive issue, and unless we solve these on a long-term basis, I think we're just going to continue to see these dramatic rises in property prices over the long term. Now, for me and other property investors, this is great news, but if you're watching this and looking to get on the housing ladder, you're really going to have to make some aggressive moves to get there sooner rather than later to benefit from this increase in inflation. But hey, that's just my opinion, and what I'm interested in is getting yours. So let me know what you think in the comments below. I'll try to reply to as many as possible. possible. If you're new to the channel, make sure to hit the subscribe button. Make sure to hit that notification bell so you see the next video coming up. And lastly, if you got value from this video, I would massively appreciate it if you lightly tap the like button, and I'll see you in the next video.